Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to the Bipartisan Policy Center and our event discussing digital counterterrorism, fighting jihadists online. Last September, when a BPC task force headed by Governor Tom Kean and Lee Hamilton took a look at the last 16 years of our counterterrorism policy to ask if we're winning the fight against terrorism, and if not, why not, and issued this report, they made the argument briefly that our counterterrorism policies aren't comprehensive enough, that too often we're focused on fighting the latest threat du jour or looking at a particular threat vector and not taking a wide-ranging enough look. And one issue that kept coming up in our conversations about that was about terrorist use of online resources. And so spurred by that, today we're releasing a new report on digital counterterrorism, fighting jihadists online, which tries to take a problem that I think we're all familiar with, but put it in a more comprehensive light. So often we talk about individual problems, whether it's the use of social media by terrorists to recruit, posting of propaganda, use of encryption to try to plan and coordinate attacks. And we try to cast all of these as part of a spectrum that we need to deal with and not think about solutions to any one of these problems, but have a more comprehensive solution that thinks about how we complicate terrorist operations online more broadly. And similarly, we say this is not a problem just in the United States, but a problem that plagues European countries and many others around the world as well. And whatever solution we come up with has to be more comprehensive internationally. And so to debate a lot of that and talk more about the report, we're very pleased to have an expert panel that's going to be moderated by Gopal Ratnam from CQ Roll Call. But before then, we are pleased to have a keynote address from Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber and International Communications and Information Policy, Rob. I don't know if you ever remember the entirety of your title yourself. Rob Strayer, to talk about some of the international dimensions of this problem. Rob has joined the State Department after a long stint on Capitol Hill, serving as General Counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and previously on the Senate Homeland Security Committee. But I think the real reason Rob got his job and the jewel in his professional crown is the time that Rob spent here at the Bipartisan Policy Center as the director of our Homeland Security project, working with Governor Kean and Congressman Hamilton, and doing a lot of really interesting work at the time on cyber issues, including a groundbreaking report on information sharing. I learned a lot from Rob at the time, and so I'm really pleased to have him back at the BPC. Rob.
Good morning. Thank you, Blaise, for that kind introduction. And I do cherish the time that we were working together as colleagues here. I also learned a lot from you. And I do want to start by thanking the Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting us here today. As Blaise mentioned, I'm at the State Department heading up the Cyber International Communications Office. My position covers all aspects of international cyberspace and internet policy, and that's from cooperating with allies to counter cyber attacks to promoting free flow of data online that underpins our digital economy, and all the way to engaging with industry on a number of issues, including coordinating on counterterrorism online policy. Countering the use of the internet for terrorist purposes is a complex and cross-cutting issue. And it's an issue that's at the nexus of cyber policy and counterterrorism, with important relationships with international human rights and other forms of international law. Therefore, we must work closely at the State Department with the Bureau of Counterterrorism and other parts of the State Department, as well as with a number of other federal departments and agencies to address this important cross-jurisdictional, cross-disciplinary issue. Countering the use of the internet for terrorist purposes is not something that we can address in isolation. It must be considered together with protecting civil liberties online, with maintaining the internet as a venue that is open, interoperable, secure, and reliable. And it also must be considered along with preserving the digital economy as an engine for future economic growth. Together, this makes countering violent Islamist extremism online one of the most important foreign policy challenges that we face today. The report that the Bipartisan Policy Center has released is an important addition to the discussion about how we can achieve these interrelated objectives. From my time at the BPC, I have an abiding appreciation of the importance of doing the hard work of reconciling competing viewpoints on contentious issues and working together to find viable, enduring consensus solutions. This is a model that can be made to work in a variety of policy areas, as the Bipartisan Policy Center has demonstrated over the years. I think that the BPC's approach to policymaking is particularly applicable to interactions between government and industry in countering terrorism online. Certainly, government and industry bring different perspectives and interests to the table, but at the end of the day, we all share an interest in keeping our country secure and ensuring that the internet can continue to play the vital role that it does in our society. By working together collaboratively, we are finding approaches that leverage America's best traditions of innovation and the dynamism of the private sector to protect society in a manner consistent with our values. As this audience is well aware, expanded use of the internet and internet-enabled information and communications technology in the last few decades has produced tremendous economic growth. Businesses benefit from open data flows across borders in order to process information in the cloud, providing enhanced computing power and very useful data analytics. Businesses also use cross-border data to maintain supply chains around the world. In the United States, internet companies are now estimated to account for 7% of our GDP, larger than the construction sector. And it is estimated that 75% of the benefits derived from information and communications technologies go to non-ICT businesses. So then, in a sense, all businesses are becoming technology companies. Around the world, billions of people have benefited from this economic growth generated by the internet, and that's provided shared prosperity and improved quality of life around the globe. The internet has also yielded new ways for people to share information. Technologies have offered unprecedented opportunities for people to connect with each other and to access information about the world around them. They are able to now participate in public debates about their future and help determine what goes on in their democracies. At the same time, the internet and other technologies are being used for nefarious purposes. As the BPC report details, social media is being used by terrorist groups to distribute propaganda, supporting their efforts to radicalize susceptible individuals to commit acts of violence and to recruit potential followers around the world. Likewise, state actors are also using these tools to sow division and undermine democratic processes. The BPC report also notes that encrypted messaging services provide secure global communications for terrorist propaganda, radicalization to violence, recruitment, and attack planning. Of course, we must recognize the seriousness of these threats, but at the same time, we must keep in mind that the internet, including social media and encryption, are incredibly powerful tools, and that technology itself is not the problem. The internet is a neutral tool, a technological medium that we have. Terrorists and other criminals who misuse this and other technologies are the problem. While we continue to work to prevent the misuse of these tools, we should recognize that technology will always be abused by bad actors, such as terrorists and other criminals. It is our responsibility, therefore, to aggressively investigate, disrupt, prosecute, and prevent crimes, protecting our society without sacrificing our fundamental values. Those values include a commitment to protecting freedom of expression and the exercise of fundamental freedoms online. We encourage countries to respect these fundamental freedoms while also preventing terrorists from using the internet to recruit followers or radicalize others to violence. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution means that the U.S. government generally cannot remove content from the internet, nor can it coerce or force others, including internet service providers, to do so. The right to freedom of expression also has international underpinnings. The freedom of expression is memorialized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and is laid out in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is a treaty to which the United States and 167 other countries belong. In the U.S. government's discussions with other foreign governments and in international venues, we stress both of these important underpinnings. There are narrow limitations on this freedom. U.S. law enforcement does not seek to compel the removal of internet content unless it clearly violates a U.S. law. For example, child pornography, criminal activity, and incitement to imminent violence are not protected. Likewise, the U.S. government recognizes the importance of strong encryption. It is a key tool to secure commerce and trade, safeguard private information, and promote freedom of expression and association. Encryption is also critical for strong cybersecurity. Encryption and anonymity tools facilitate digital safety for at-risk users, including journalists, members of civil society, and citizens from malevolent states and non-state actors. At the same time, encryption poses a grave challenge for our national security and law enforcement professionals who work to ensure that malicious actors are held to account and cannot exploit technology as a means to evade the law. There will always be the risk that encryption may be used by terrorists or others for illegal purposes, and we must do our utmost to prevent this. With this in mind, we and others in the government will continue to engage with the private sector to find ways to address the national security and public challenges we face with the use of encryption. While we work to counter the use of the internet for terrorist purposes, we must continue to focus on the terrorists and potential terrorists themselves. This means countering violent extremism and terrorism online must be an integral part of our CVE campaign. Likewise, while we continue to work closely with industry to assess how Russia used social media to conduct influence efforts and sow division, we must also focus directly on the unacceptable actions themselves. We will cooperate with our allies to deter future Russian misbehavior. We must impose costs on Russia for their unacceptable actions, ranging from influence operations to cyber attacks. The transborder nature of the internet means it's not just the United States trying to figure out what the right approach is to address the challenges from threats online. There are many other nations involved in this, and we're going to have to work together to find interoperable solutions that are tailored to each nation's constitutional and legal systems. And to prevent the fragmentation of the internet, these solutions must be done in a manner that does not disrupt the international flow of data. As we approach these complicated policy issues, we need to avoid falling into the trap of false dichotomies. On the one hand, we can counter the use of internet for terrorist purposes, and we must also be able to protect freedom of expression, secure communications, and the open, interoperable, secure, and reliable nature of the internet. Those are not mutually exclusive objectives. We should recognize that governments have both an obligation to protect their citizens and an obligation to ensure that citizens can enjoy the benefits of the internet. We must avoid a fragmented internet and rules that limit freedom of expression and that frustrate innovation. Addressing these interrelated obligations requires public policy measures that are carefully crafted to counter terrorism without creating barriers to innovation and free expression. If, in the name of promoting security, government subjects the digital economy to unnecessarily bureaucratic structures, processes, and regulations, or if it politicizes technical innovation, they will limit its dynamic nature, impose inefficient controls on users, and stifle future economic growth. So what should government do? We believe that government should take appropriate steps to counter the use of the internet for terrorist purposes while respecting their international obligations and commitments regarding the freedoms of expression, association, freedom of assembly, and religion. And that as well, they should note that they should allow the free flow of information and an open and interoperable internet. Efforts to counter terrorism in cyberspace should focus on criminal activities that facilitate terrorism, such as recruitment, illicit financing, attack planning and coordination, and other crimes committed online. Counterterrorism should not be used as a justification to limit free speech or as a pretext for targeting political opposition or suppressing dissent. Engagement with industry to counter terrorism online should be done on a collaborative basis. Private companies are free to choose to voluntarily remove terrorist websites or social media accounts that contain content that violates their user service agreements. In engaging with the private sector companies in this manner, governments should take great care to ensure that they do not engage directly or indirectly in censorship that is inconsistent with respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Furthermore, governments should take care to avoid unintentionally restricting the abilities of those who seek to identify and counter violent extremist messaging online. Now a word about the private sector. Over the last several years, the U.S. technology sector has become significantly more active in efforts to counter the use of its platforms for terrorist purposes, and we applaud those efforts. For example, Facebook announced in 2017 they would be hiring more than 3,000 new employees to focus on reviewing and potentially removing terrorist messaging on its platform. And Twitter has increased its activity in this space through account suspensions and dramatically limited the ability of groups like ISIS to radicalize and recruit individuals to violence on its platform. Likewise, Google and YouTube have also implemented programs to increase the speed with which terrorist content is identified and removed from its platforms. The BBC report highlights some great examples of industry collaboration in this area that I would like to highlight. The industry-led Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, which was announced in June of 2017 by Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, and Google and YouTube, builds on existing initiatives by industry and brings them together under a single umbrella organization. The Forum to Counterterrorism efforts combine several existing industry initiatives to address terrorist recruitment material on the internet and to promote counter-narratives to potential terrorist recruits. Initiatives under the Forum to Counterterrorism focus on development of technological solutions, research, and knowledge sharing. There's also an effort to bring smaller and emerging technology companies into the forum to help share best practices with regards to countering terrorism online. This includes the partnership with another important initiative called the Tech Against Terrorism, which is the United Nations Counterterrorism Executive Directorate project to build trust with global technology industry to help support companies in tackling the use of the internet for terrorist purposes while still respecting human rights. It's very important that we work with not just the largest social media platforms, but as well as work with small and medium enterprises in the technology space. Another important initiative is the Shared Hashing Database, a partnership between the founders of the Forum to Counterterrorism, which seeks to establish hashes, which are unique digital fingerprints for terrorist media products that have been removed from their services. The use of this database makes it easier for industry to share identified terrorist information across their platforms and decrease the amount of time that identified terrorist content exists on platforms before its removal. While removing terrorist content is important when done appropriately and is a shared objective of government and industry, we should not get too fixated on taking down content instantly. Government engagement with industry on removals needs to be cognizant of the technical realities of removing content on large distributed platforms and not unduly limit the freedom of expression and ability of companies to do business online. If we push for too quick a removal process, it could create a perverse incentive for companies to take down anything remotely controversial, lest they potentially face fines from governmental authorities. And that's not something we want to see happening. Likewise, governments need to consider the focus of their efforts to push for removal of terrorist content. What is illegal in one jurisdiction is not necessarily illegal in another. In some countries, particularly the United States, place a premium on the ability of people to freely access information online. Furthermore, we need to recognize the technical limits of what is possible. While at some point in the future, it may be possible for artificial intelligence or machine learning to accurately identify de novo terrorist content, we want to make sure that automated decision-making is well tested and does not inappropriately suppress potentially protected or lawful content, which may include religious speech. All of these competing concerns argue for the need for robust discussion, including all stakeholders, before government introduces new legislation or policies in this area. Oftentimes, alternative viewpoints are more effective responses to objectionable speech than suppression of that speech. Governments need to work closely and creatively with civil society, academia, and the private sector, and to commit to enhance online access and build appropriate digital literacy skills for those that can be the strongest voices to counter that messaging. Those include community leaders, religious leaders, women, and youth that can be effective messengers to counter those narratives. This type of counter speech is also an important element of countering terrorism online. Each of the 4 founding industry members of the Forum to Counterterrorism already has robust counter-speech initiatives in place. In conclusion, I'd like to offer the observation that the challenge of countering terrorism online, like the internet itself, is a multifaceted challenge, and it demands and requires multi-stakeholder engagement. It is going to require the collaboration and cooperation of many actors to address this challenge. I'm confident by following the BPC's example of finding strength and creativity through a diverse range of viewpoints and differences of opinion, that governments, industry, and civil society can come together to further advance these collaborative efforts to counter the use of the internet for terrorist purposes. For everyone here today, I look forward to partnering with you on these and other important issues. Please stay in touch with me and my team at the State Department. I would note that Alex Greenstein is also here with me today from my office. Unfortunately, I need to return to the State Department for other meetings, but I look forward to watching the discussion online later. And I just want to commend all of you for taking part in this discussion. I think we're on a long road here. We're probably not going to solve this today, but I think this is an important step forward, including with this report. So please let us know at the State Department the challenges you are facing and how we can work better together with you. Thank you.
All right, good morning, welcome. My name is Gopal Ratnam. I'm a reporter with Congressional Quarterly Roll Call. I've covered a variety of national security topics for the last 15-something years, and now I cover sort of like the technology and the intersection of technology and policy issues for Congressional Quarterly. I want to say thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center for inviting me, and I want to give a special shout out to my good friend Toby Zakaria. She and I covered a lot of Pentagon and defense issues back in the day when things were a lot more benign. And I want to say that Toby is one of the finest journalists in Washington, and if people don't know, and she broke one of the most biggest stories in town about Iraq and WMD. Thank you, Toby. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists here today. To my most immediate left is Joshua Geltzer. Sorry. He's the Executive Director for the Institute of Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at the Georgetown University Law Center. And he's a former Senior Director for Counterterrorism on the National Security Council. And he's also a founding Executive Director for this project at the university. And he served previously, like I said, on the NSC for 2 years, from 2015 to 2017. And to his left is Seamus Hughes, who is the Deputy Director for the Program on Extremism at the George Washington University. And Seamus has served previously worked at the National Counterterrorism Center and created one of the most important intervention programs to steer individuals away from violence through non-law enforcement means. And he's also worked with the FBI Joint Counterterrorism Center. And to the extreme left is Blaise Mistal, who is, sorry?
Yes, yeah, politically especially.
All right, no, we're not talking about political. We're talking about the geographic.
As far over there as I can.
Is the director of the National Security Program at the BPC, and he has testified before Congress, and he's also written and directed the 2009 simulation called the Cyber Shockwave. I want to start by asking the question. I want to give a shout out to this report. It's a really well-written report, and usually you read think tank reports in Washington, your eyes glaze over. I thought it was beautifully written, and I particularly like this one sentence I just want to quote on the top. Verbal combat on Twitter calls for the quick stings of a yellow jacket, not the cautiously aimed salvos of an artillerist. I said, wow, that's interesting in a think tank report. But I want to ask the question, so reading the report, the most important question is which agency in the United States is really in charge in terms of countering violent extremism online. Obviously, there's a little bit of the responsibility in the hands of the State Department and the GEC, but DHS has some role. I want to see if each of you can talk a little bit about who has who is the key, which is the key agency in charge, or should we be? And then the next question is, should there be a single entity taking care of this effort? Sure.
I'm happy to start. I know others will have thoughts on this as well. Let me add my thanks for the invitation to be part of this this conversation today, which I'm very much looking forward to, and also echo the compliments on what I think is a terrific report, really thought-provoking and well done, and I think will yield a good conversation both today and after today as well. So on the question of who's in charge, here I might echo the remarks from Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Strayer, in that this is the type of challenge that crosses bureaucratic lines, in part because it has different aspects to it and involves different authorities in responding to it. So it involves audiences abroad, it involves audiences at home, it involves the private sector, it involves the executive branch, it could involve the legislative branch potentially as the issue continues to evolve. And so when I was in government, and frankly still, I'm somewhat comfortable personally with the conclusion that this takes an interagency effort. It's not, it can neither be handed to one department as currently constituted, nor does there necessarily need to be a whole new department to handle it. But what I also felt in government and continue to feel now is that bringing together the people who work on these issues across those departments and agencies is critical if you want them to actually coordinate and be collaborative and bring to bear their different expertise. And that's what I and many, many others in the government tried to do with both the foreign-facing Global Engagement Center, or GEC, at the State Department, and the Countering Violent Extremism Task Force at the Department of Homeland Security. Both of those entities had a home at a particular department, but they brought together folks from all sorts of other portions of the government to try to work in one place and bring to bear their different expertises. And we may want to get into sort of how that experiment is faring, but maybe let me pause there. Seamus will have more thoughts on this.
Sure. I mean, I agree with all your points on that, and also congratulations on the report. I think it was very well done. Internationally, it's actually a little bit easier. It's very kind of clear who does international counter-messaging. State Department has the lead on kind of the more overt stuff, and we can talk about the successes and failures in that aspect. DoD does delayed attribution, so they do counter-messaging and then eventually tell someone they're from DoD. And then the CIA and the intelligence community can do kind of the more covert actions for counter-messaging. Domestically, it's a complete mess, to be fair. And the joys of not being in government, you can say that. For the most part, we've ceded the space for domestic counter-messaging to private companies. And it's probably the only time you see inherently governmental responsibility ceded to technology companies. DHS has dipped their toe in the water in terms of playing the role of convener, bringing together tech companies and community partners. But for the most part, we've said to the big four of tech companies, this is your problem, can you take care of it for us? And in many ways, kind of the approach for that is fraught with a lot of different concerns. Who sets the standards for removal of content? How much content do you remove? How little do you remove? What does that mean when, in this case, ISIS has primarily moved away from most mainstream sites? They're still on Twitter, they're still on Facebook and all of those things, but for the most part, the English language ISIS scene is largely concentrated on Telegram and other apps like that. Telegram's not at the table, and they got 3 folks that do this full time. And so if you're trying to address kind of an issue that is increasingly going to the margins, your approach on kind of a big four tech is not going to get you what you want to get. And so now we're in this weird time where we haven't actually figured it out. One last point I think I would mention is being government where there's the occasion to be slow on recognizing how to respond. And so you saw a good amount of effort doing broad-based counter-messaging. So think of a Don't Do Drugs campaign, a 30-second clip on YouTube, which frankly makes us all feel better and we watch it and things like that, but it doesn't necessarily get you to your target audience, right? If your target audience is the 3 kids in Kansas who are thinking about joining ISIS, they're not going to be watching the 30-second clip that features some celebrity that talks about joint terrorism. So you're going to have to move away from broad-based messaging to more one-on-one intervention online, and there's been some interesting research recently on that.
Do you have any thoughts, Terry?
Sure. I mean, first of all, let me start off by saying that the report was really the work of many hands, and I just wanted to thank some of them Jessica Michek, Mike Hurley, and many of the talented consultants that we have working with us on the task force for terrorism and ideology. And I'd echo many of the points that Josh and Seamus already made, and maybe just to sort of put the nail in the coffin on the need for coordination, point out that the dichotomies that we have in the way the government functions, right? So the sort of foreign versus domestic that Seamus laid out aren't necessarily the way that terrorist organizations function, right? So if you have someone from ISIS in Syria communicating with an American teenager in Kansas, sort of who's in charge of tracking that, who's in charge of trying to counter that message? Mm-hmm. What if it's an American that's with ISIS in Syria, as Seamus's organization has shown there have been some, right? What if the message is being sent by a Brit? Do we need to be able to coordinate with the British on some of these issues? And so the way that we break these things down isn't necessarily very, very productive and very reflective of the way they actually work in the real world, which is why I do think a coordinating function across the many departments that do have a stake in this is going to be very important.
If I may add just one more thing. It was a very important point what you made in terms of not bifurcating this a little bit. So if you look at counter messaging, there's actually a role for the kind of the offline, for lack of a better word. So think of a few years ago, you had a team of folks in Raqqa, they were called the Legion internally in the FBI, right? These were English-speaking folks, mostly Brits, that were reaching out to Westerners, encouraging attacks, right? Junaid Hussain, Sally Jones, kind of household names for the CT folks. They were very coordinated in terms of reaching out to Americans and Westerners to encourage attacks. The FBI and DoD and our coalition partners worked together and identified these individuals and then committed a series of airstrikes and killed a good number of them. That actually had an effect on counter-messaging and propaganda output and planning. Now we can debate the moral efficacy of going after a counter-messenger, but there's something to be said about marrying up those two aspects.
The other question I have is, there was a report just last week about how the State Department's Global Engagement Center hasn't really spent the money it's been given by Congress. Although the bulk of the story focused on the, pushing back on the Russian propaganda, there was also mention in that of how there's like $14 million plus another $19 million that Congress provided the center for CVE, and that hasn't been spent as well. So I guess the question is, how do we judge what is the efficacy of this work, even in the context of global focus? Like Seamus, you pointed out that maybe the domestic is a mess, but internationally speaking as well, how are we doing?
Yeah, you want to start? Go for it.
I'll take a piece, but Seamus and others will have more thoughts on this. So you're right that story, which I found concerning last week, focused largely on not counterterrorism or counter-violent extremism communication work or counter-messaging work out of the GEC, but other work, although that other work seems particularly critical these days, and in fact it was Congress that quite deliberately expanded the mandate of the GEC in a move that looks somewhat prescient, frankly, to try to deal with other problems. Counter-messaging, just like for counterterrorism, is never going to be the totality of the solution to other problems, but it may have a role to play. Even within the counterterrorism space, the GEC under this administration has seemed slow to obtain even the funds already allocated to it, let alone the funds that a structure had been built that allowed the State Department to go get more funding from the Defense Department. There's nothing that would take us back from that lively prose faster than to go into budgetary conversation. The big picture is that it does seem like there's been an underutilization of the GEC and, frankly, some key departures of folks from it. And on the domestic side, the CVE task force from the outside looks like it has had a similar challenge of losing key personnel and potentially not getting all of the support or being able to utilize all of the grant money allocated to it, in part because grantees had certain concerns given a new tone and language about these issues. And counter-messaging is really hard. I don't think any of us would sit here and say we've seen this government, or maybe any government, totally crack the code, and even at its best, counter-messaging is not going to solve these problems. But I do think if you underfund and lose key people from the entities built to try to be better at this and to try to have the U.S. government get out of the business of tweeting back at terrorists and into the business of amplifying voices that are already credible in certain communities, finding those voices, helping to stimulate the emergence of other voices. At least that's your best shot at it. And what worries me is that we haven't had that best shot emerge since these institutions have been built, because they do seem not to have been sustained over the past year or so in key ways.
Yeah, I would just add a few things. I mean, when you look at this, in many ways, it's a political question. So, you know, the Hill basically forced this mandate onto the State Department. It's like, you know, if you ran track your entire life and then the coach tells you the next day you're going to go swimming, right? It's going to take you a little bit to learn how to do the breaststroke. And so you have this, an organization that was not set up to do this and now has been expanded their mandate. And then I think we need to look at the kind of the other side of the political question, which is you've had the GEC and its earlier iterations go through some stumbles to go through it. So for a long time, they were doing counter messaging in 6 or 7 languages. To be fair, I thought it was pretty good. Overt. At some point, they got the mandate to do English language counter messaging. That's also the point when you and your colleagues could then read what the messages were saying, and it became the front page Washington Post story about how bad counter messaging is. And so I don't necessarily think it's fair to these folks. If we're going to give them a mandate, we also have to give them political cover. And so you have to have the chance to make a huge failure on counter messaging, learn from that failure, and adjust accordingly. And until we have both that political coverage, both in the administration, but frankly from the Hill, I don't see the State Department and other organizations jumping into the water and learning how to swim. I see them just kind of wading their way through it and seeing how this goes out. There's no upside right now for them, right? It's one thing to counter, jihadist propaganda. It's another thing to go after a state.
And to amplify some of that, I think it's the emphasis on metrics can be ambivalent here, right? On the one hand, when we spend taxpayers' money, we want to know that it's having some sort of effect, and we want some way to measure what we do and to figure out what is effective, right? But I think the mandate to be able to show immediate effect, to show metrics right away, can be counterproductive. And we've seen this with some of the DoD counter-messaging campaigns, where you had an emphasis on hiring as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. That led to getting some people who weren't necessarily, this was being done in Arabic, the best Arabic speakers. And then when it's the people who are actually running the counter messaging are keeping track of their supposed metrics of what the interactions they've had and whether they code them as successful or not. You learn that they might have incentives to code things a certain way regardless of how the interventions they participated in actually went. And so I think we want to be careful to both be able to have trial and error, to try to figure out what works without putting undue political pressure to immediately be able to demonstrate through qualitative metrics that, yes, we are having an impact.
That's probably one of the most important points. The question of metrics is it's also a question of what your objective is. If your objective is to convince a young man to not like ISIS, that's one objective. If your other objective is just to keep him busy online so he's not planning an attack, that's a completely different objective. And it determines how you do counter messaging.
And it also, and this is building on that and agreeing with all of it, it also fits into a broader strategic context that one hopes the government has and provides to those who work on these issues about how counter-messaging fits with outreach to tech companies about where we are in terms of the bad content not being as easily available, with what's being done offline, as Seamus emphasized before, which is still a very real space where radicalization occurs. So even the counter-messaging only makes maximum sense in a broader strategic mosaic, and it's not clear if that is being communicated or even crafted right now.
So I mean, we've seen a lot of reporting that the geographic space available for Islamic State, for example, has shrunk. But like the report notes, that does not mean. That only means that the global communications end-to-end encryption technologies will provide an alternate forum for these groups. So Seamus, maybe you're the best on this. So what is the state of messaging, recruitment, propaganda by these groups using these non-geographic spaces to spread the message? Has it gotten worse? Has it Some of the pushback from the United States and other governments and private entities has been effective. How does one judge that?
Yeah, so 2015 was kind of the banner year for at least Western recruitment to ISIS. And the platform of choice at that time was Twitter. At the Program Extremism, we collected about a million ISIS English language tweets over a year to get a sense of what the scene was like. That collection is nearly gone now, and that's a reflection of Twitter cracking down and doing more comprehensive takedowns. I think, it's an uncomfortable thing to say, I think, as a society that likes free speech and things like that, but you can measure effectiveness on takedown, and you do see how that did affect the network. Now, I don't think it's the be-all, end-all for these things, but it's something to keep in mind as you do that. Largely, our folks, at least the American ISIS scene and frankly, the European ISIS scene, has shifted to Telegram. So think of the good old days of 10 years ago. Everybody's on a dozen password-protected forums. We could collect against them. You had to know somebody to get in, but it wasn't particularly hard. You had to be primed about the ideology to be excited to go on those forums, right? Then the explosion of social media, you're able to get the fence sitters, you're able to get the curious kid in Illinois who has questions about what's happening in Syria, and then a recruiter can pull them in. That's now largely kind of minimized on the mainstream sites, and now you're in this weird hybrid between the old and the new, which is Telegram. Relatively open platform, but it takes you a little bit of time to find the channels. You have to be primed about the narrative to do so. And so it changes the way you should do counter messaging too.
And just to add to that, that overall strikes me, to the extent one can characterize these things broadly, as something of a good news story, right? Because if, as this report, I think, rightly documents, if what we were used to a few years ago was something of a two-step, where someone potentially interested in jihadism found, quite easily, frankly, a hashtag campaign or a video to watch on YouTube or a group to join on Facebook, and then showing some continued interest was eventually taken, often one-on-one, into encrypted channels where they were really led down the road of radicalization, whether that meant to join on the battlefield in Iraq and Syria as a foreign fighter, whether that meant inciting an attack by that individual where he or she lived. That was sort of the two-step, from the very open platforms to the very much encrypted, often one-on-one conversations. And you kind of needed the first to get people into the second if you were a terrorist group. And the fact that the first has become at least less hospitable place, not totally inhospitable, but less hospitable place, at least something of a contested space, that's a good news story. And that this hybrid of a Telegram where there are parts that you can kind of stumble may give it too little credit, but you can find your way into conversations if you were interested in this. And then you can very much find your way from there into the closed conversations. I'm still glad when it's not as easy to start, when it takes some work to find those initial conversations that then lead down a path that, as the report documents, is very hard once it gets into the encrypted channels for law enforcement or the intelligence community to see what's happening, let alone intervene. So overall, that strikes me as something of a good news story, but it, of course, yields its own challenges because it's a change, and that requires adaptation by those who don't want to see terrorist groups basically refine a different sort of recruitment model, all happening on a platform like Telegram.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would also say you can't think of this in a vacuum, right? If you have a Drink Pepsi campaign, you also got to sell the Pepsi. You got to have Pepsi to sell. And the fact that, I mean, you can track why the numbers of American jihadists went from 20 a year to 61 arrests in 2015. It's because this announcement of a so-called caliphate, this idea of perceived religious obligation, was a driver for a lot of these folks, right? The bug light went on and everyone chased it. Now, as they continue to lose territory, the narrative's going to shift away from travel to Syria and Iraq and much more towards either a romanticization of the so-called caliphate. So we had this great thing and coalition took it away from us, it's time to avenge. But in many ways, actually, ISIS essentially re-upped a narrative that was pervasive throughout kind of the Islamist ideology, which is this idea of a caliphate. So they re-upped it enough so the next guy that comes in, it's still fresh in the mind. And I think that's something that we got to keep in mind as we do. Physical space is actually very important in this. There's a reason why 30,000 people showed up in Syria and Iraq from different countries. And they didn't show up in those numbers in other conflicts.
Yeah, I was actually largely wanted to make that point as well, that we can't sort of divide what's happening in the online space from what's happening in the physical world. And while I think we're better off today in the online world than we were a couple of years ago, as Josh mentioned, I think the cycle that Seamus just described, we've seen before, right? I mean, there was jihad in Afghanistan. There was a call for people for mujahideen to come to Afghanistan, and people yielded that without Twitter or Instagram back in the day, right? And then there was sort of a burrowing into Afghanistan. Then there was the next fight in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then there was a burrowing in of Al-Qaeda in places like Yemen. Then we've had ISIS, and now we're in this burrowing in phase again. But it's happening in a much, I think, bigger physical space. You're seeing it in Africa, not just the Middle East. You're seeing it in Southeast Asia. And even though I think we're better off now than we were a couple of years ago, I don't think we've foresaw the possibility that there's going to be another call to jihad, and there's going to be another emergence of whether it's a caliphate or some other model of something that is going to be attractive enough to people that they're going to be coming from all over the world in droves, like they were a couple of years ago to Syria, to join up this new model. And whether it's Twitter in 5 years or Telegram or some other platform, I think we need to be ready for that and sort of not just rest on whatever laurels we think we might have.
And we, in many ways, have to make sure we track the network that's set up beforehand, right? So, we did a pretty comprehensive study on Americans who successfully got to Syria and Iraq. We identified 64 Americans, which pales in comparison to any other Western country, right? But the ones that went because their best friends or their sister or their brother also went with them. So, of course, they're online because the average age of an ISIS recruit is 28, right? So if you're online, it makes sense. You're also breathing. It doesn't really tell you much, right? An indicator for folks going is if somebody else in the real world also shares their beliefs. And in the U.S. context, we don't necessarily have these kind of well-worn networks that you would have, say, in Belgium or parts of the UK, where you have to kind of be a moron not to figure out how to get to Turkey and cross the border and talk to a facilitator. In the U.S., it's a little bit harder, so you're reaching out online, but we can't discount the role of kind of the offline dynamics.
I mean, we touched on the aspect of how, because of the open platforms being less accessible, has pushed a lot of this recruitment and propaganda onto the encrypted channels, and that kind of is a good segue to talk about how, I mean, there's a big chunk of the report on encryption and what that means, and how law enforcement is struggling with this challenge of quote-unquote going dark. And the report mentions how there isn't an easy solution. I mean, if you want to crack down on encryption and make everything easily accessible to the government, that infringes on free speech. So the report talks about a layered approach, and I was wondering, Blaise, if you want to talk a little bit about what you think are some of the elements of this layered approach.
Sure. So I think the fundamental insight here is, as we've just been talking about, there's no sort of one dimension of this problem of terrorism online, right? There's the propaganda issue of posting videos about how wonderful the caliphate is in Syria. There's the recruitment issue where people start reaching out to individuals directly through social media. And there's the attack planning element, where often these conversations are taken offline or onto encrypted channels. And I think what we try to do in the report is say, too often we focus on one of these problems and say we need to solve this. So we need to solve the fact that al-Awlaki's sermons are online and accessible on YouTube and inciting people to Islamist extremism, and so we need to figure out a takedown policy. And what we say is, if you think about this more broadly as a range of activities, all of which contribute to the problem, and then say, well, think about terrorism as a range, sort of a range of positions, right? A path that someone travels, and think about not just stopping the violent act itself, but possible interventions earlier and earlier in the stage. Then you can think about it not as we have to stop an individual, we need to stop communications at exactly this one point, but you can think about it exactly like you said, as layered security, right? So you try to put up hurdles at each point along the way. And the argument we make is it's probably politically easier and cheaper to try to get 30, 40, 50% solutions at multiple steps in the process rather than 100% or a 90% solution at any one point. And I think that the encryption one is very telling of that. If you think about terrorism, as only the sort of the violent act and the planning of the violent act. And what we need to do is we need to have a law enforcement approach that finds the guy who's trying to buy the gun or build the bomb or being told when and where to attack, and we need to get to him before he does that. Then intercepting those communications between whoever it is in Raqqa that's helping orchestrate the attack and whoever it is in New York City that's planning to put a bomb in Times Square becomes the be-all and end-all of stopping attacks. And then you say, all right, we really need to solve this problem, what Director Comey used to call going dark, right? We need to have, whether it's Apple or whether it's Google or whether it's Telegram, give us the encryption keys so that, maybe messages are encrypted when they're going back and forth, but the US government has some way to read those so that when we think Joe Smith is communicating with someone in Raqqa, we can go and read those messages. But as Das Strayer just pointed out, there's a whole lot of downsides to that, right? There's downsides in cybersecurity. There's a lot of reasons we want our messages to be encrypted, and if we build key ways of getting into those for the good guys, then the bad guys can be able to get those. There's issues of the way the digital economy functions. There's the way that American companies are treated by foreign governments, and what foreign governments use their ability to read encrypted communications to do. And then there's the political opposition from people who rightfully have privacy concerns about what the government's going to do. So pushing against all of those just to get at this one guy might be too much. But if you say, we're going to invest in ways to try to get at encrypted communications, whether that's trying to come up with lawful hacking means, so building the capability within the government to try to break what is strong encryption that's built by the private sector community. Whether that's coming up with ways to work with our international counterparts to have ways to do that. Then it might not get every encrypted communication you want to read, but if you're getting 50% of it at lower cost, then you can try to put some of that political energy into other things, working with the private sector to take down the most egregious forms of propaganda, putting together counter-messaging approaches with civil society groups, to try to get at some of the people even earlier in the process before they're even talking to a planner in Raqqa. So that's the idea behind sort of a more comprehensive look at terrorist activity online and the layered security approach, sort of picking off the easy, the lowest hanging fruit at each of the steps might make us more secure than trying to get a maximal solution at any one point in the process.
Do you have anything to add?
No, I would just add that, this is going to be the great debate in this space for a number of times. Tech companies were pulled kicking and screaming to take down content, but now it's kind of the new norm for them. It's easy to take down a beheading video and know that we should take down this beheading video. It's quite another thing to say, let me have the keys to your encryption. Right. And the same administration officials that are railing against the need to have encryption are the same ones who are sending me a message on Signal about the latest thing, right? And in many ways, we use these encrypted apps to build sources. You saw the role of Telegram and when it went down in Iran for the latest protests. You see the need for these type of applications. At the same time, there's 109 messages between the Garland shooter and an overseas terrorist, which DOJ does not have access to. And we haven't had this debate, and I commend the Bipartisan Policy Center for starting this conversation. But a lot of this is going to have to be a weighing of the two. And to be frank, I don't see the tech companies moving very quickly on this. After San Bernardino, the fact that Apple put their foot down and didn't give access to an individual who killed 14 people and injured dozens of others, they decided, and they won that debate. I don't see them doing the same thing for a young man who's talking about how great ISIS is on a channel. If you can put your foot down on individuals who killed Americans, then the bar has been set at that point.
And one more point on the encrypted side, which is as this debate, I hope, continues and matures, I think there's a practical evolution that hasn't quite been factored in. Because even if one imagined the strongest possible legislation implemented by the strongest possible regulation, trying to do what the Brits have threatened to do, which is essentially bar end-to-end encryption being available to consumers. Put aside your views on the merits or demerits of that. It's not clear to me that absent something like a great firewall, that would actually cut off US-based users from being able relatively easily to access end-to-end encrypted technology. Because in a world of an interconnected internet, those entities like Telegram that either aren't subject to U.S. jurisdiction or will act like they aren't subject to U.S. jurisdiction and probably get away with acting that way, it's not clear to me that they respond to new legislation or new regulation. Maybe some actors don't go out and find it, because presumably it wouldn't be offered as easily in that case. But the savvy actors and terrorists, they're not all savvy, but they at least have enough savvy actors who in Telegram chats say, use this and don't use that, or make sure you get the latest update to this, because otherwise it appears to have vulnerabilities. The terrorist actors strike me as still likely able to find these technologies, and that adds a practical complication that I think needs to get filtered into the conceptual, legal, policy, even moral debates that have, I think, grown a little bit stale on the encryption issue.
I have a bunch of more questions, but I want to take questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, identify yourself, and state your question. The lady in the front here. Do we have a microphone, or is she just going to call out her question? Okay. This lady here in the front.
Hi, Stacy Bridges, Veterans Vision. I'm concerned about the propaganda that's going out. This has happened before. It's, if you know your history, they did it back in World War II, whether it be with pamphlets or Walt Disney or Warner Brothers fighting this counter propaganda with humor and cartoons even. How are we able, with all the brilliant minds and all the agencies that we have, how are we able to change the message with a meme? How can you sum up all the information that you have and put it in a little meme, a little picture, and change the conversation? Because with all your education, if you can't do that, we're missing the boat. We're missing that message. We're missing those kids. That was my comment. My question is, what are you doing to recruit that young blood? Because Russia, all they needed was a couple of people in a basement. They didn't care if they smoked weed or did whatever. They could hack. They had jokes. They had information. They put it forward, and they changed the minds. They divided a country, and you can divide and conquer. What are we doing to bring those hackers, those good people, those social media? So what if they smoked a joint, okay? Who cares? If they can get into this whole propaganda thing and change the conversation and clown these people and make them out of jokes, if we can do that, what are you doing to reach those younger people to get them in? So, you know, you guys with all your degrees aren't fighting, because you're not going to be able to take down a guy with some Doritos and a blunt.
Right.
Okay?
I think it seems like there are two questions. I mean, what are we doing to, like, you know, get, which is one of the strengths of America, which is the Hollywood, into the scene in order to be able to, like she says, ridicule some of these ideas. And second, what are we doing to hire kids in the underground, so to speak?
I'm happy to say a couple of words. I'm sure others will have thoughts as well. It's funny, and you may be familiar with this. It's funny you mentioned, in particular, the idea of you know, young kids who might have used marijuana. Director Comey at one point said, we need to hire some folks who are young and who know how to use computers, and it may be we need to give some security clearances to some folks who've done some marijuana. And he got a ton of flack from certain folks on the Hill, but he also got a lot of people who said, those are the type of people you do need to bring in. So you are echoing Director Comey with those words. I do think we need that sort of young talent. When the Global Engagement Center was stood up, the executive order that created it or transitioned it from the CSCC that had preceded it gave it a certain hiring authority, 3161 hiring authority, that was explicitly there so that it could hire people from outside government faster and more nimbly. Now, faster and more nimbly by government standards was still, to the frustration of some of us who didn't necessarily think fast and nimble characterized the pace it took, but it was an effort. And unfortunately, when I alluded before to some of the folks who have left because they felt like that entity and others sharing the mission haven't had the full support of leadership, including political cover, which Seamus is totally right, is essential to trial and error in a space that we haven't figured out yet. Those folks aren't still there, and I don't know whether there are new folks being brought in from the outside. I think that particular authority expired after a year. That's a real problem, because you need, if you want to be as nimble as those who are using trial and error. And these terrorist groups aren't perfect messengers either. They just flood the space, and then they see what resonates, and they reuse those memes, and they adapt them, and they translate them. They splice them into new videos. And the ones that don't resonate, they just ditch those themes. So if counter-messaging is going to take off, it's going to take off because there's both creativity in doing it and political cover for trying some things. And so I'm echoing in some ways your concern about getting the right people and letting them try new tactics.
I think I can make a pretty good meme if given the chance. But no, I think you're absolutely right. And towards the tail end of the Obama administration, there was an effort called Madison Valleywood, which is the most phenomenal name for a project ever, which combined Madison Avenue, Hollywood, and Silicon Valley.
It was supposed to be an internal work game, and then it just stuck.
CNBC, figured it out. And so the idea was we bring all the smartest people in the world from the ad agencies, tech companies, Hollywood, we put them all in a room, and they'll figure out how to do counter messaging. Well, the thing is, they actually did. The problem is always going to be implementation. Like, when I was in government, I had really great ideas, I thought. Nobody could implement them. And we always have this idea, if we just bring in smart people, they'll figure it out. Well, the big machine that is bureaucracy will grind them down. And so if that is true, then you need to look at the outside space for efforts. And so you need to kind of team up with non-governmental actors. You need to team up with other folks to do that. The problem is we haven't lowered the bar for entry. And so if you're dealing with a jihadist who likes ISIS, they're going to spend 20 hours a day tweeting about how great ISIS is. If you're dealing with a person who wants to counter ISIS, they're going to do it in between a lunch break because they care about it, but they don't really, they're not spending 20 hours of their day doing it. But there is some kind of low-hanging fruit we can do to make this a little bit easier. So, if you're a religious leader or a community leader who wants to do counter messaging, you're probably not going to reach out to Junaid Hussain and try to do counter messaging. Because if you do, you'll probably end up on a secondary watch list every time you go to Dulles Airport. So if we can give assurances for people that we trust in terms of how to do counter messaging, if we can explain what the right and left lines are on material support to terrorism, so that if you're engaging with a known or suspected terrorist, you're going to have some coverage from the local field office. It's not going to mean that you get pushed up against a wall, right? So let's figure this out. And I think if you throw enough lawyers in a room and take away food, you can get a 2-page memo out of this and very quickly kind of at least lower the bar.
Let me add one more layer to this, which is I'm not necessarily sure that we have the community of people we need to actually be able to do this well. So, it'd be nice to have the hiring authority, it'd be nice to have sort of the legal protections. But when you think back to the Cold War, right, the government actually invested a lot of money in training criminologists, right, putting financial incentives for place and for people to not just go to learn Russian, but actually learn about the way that the decision-making process of the Kremlin works, to try to understand the Soviet Union, right? To take your example, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, they actually had to send people to the United States to come here and try to learn about what the political cleavages are, to learn about how to make a meme that works for America, right? They had to learn about us. And I'm sort of worried that we're 16 years into the war on terrorism, and maybe we've been funding people to learn Arabic, but have we been funding people to learn about the ideological and theological debates that people are having, the ISIS recruiters are having with people who are trying to recruit on a very deep level? Are we funding them to have a deep enough understanding of some of the Arab cultures, if we're talking about trying to do counter messaging abroad, to engage with people about the issues that are really driving them to care about these things? And even at a higher level, do we even think enough about those issues to do quality control from a coordinating perspective? I mean, if you think about the public diplomacy initiatives that we created in the wake of 9/11, things like Radio Sawa, Al Hura TV, Arabic language broadcasting to the Middle East, right? We often don't know enough about what's happening on those channels. We don't know enough about what's salient about the people that we hired to do those. So we hired a number of people for Al Hura TV, for the Lebanon channel, Lebanese Christians. We thought, great, they're Christians. That means they're not going to be Islamist extremists. They're Lebanese. They know the local culture. They speak Arabic. Well, it turns out there was a large portion of Al Hura employees who maybe were Maronite Christians, but they were from a part of the Maronite sect that was closely allied with Hezbollah. And so we had a pocket of Hezbollah supporters working out of a U.S. government-funded broadcaster, putting out Hezbollah not overtly, but messaging into Lebanon on issues that largely coincided with what Hezbollah cared about. Did anybody in the U.S. government know enough about the makeup of Lebanese society to really be able to tell what was going on? Not really, right? And so, I'm a little worried that we're not creating and then investing in the expertise that we need either in the government or more broadly within academic and civil sectors to really be engaged in this fight in a meaningful way going forward.
Yeah, the gentleman in the front.
Jeremiah Young, American University. As someone who's grown up with the internet, I have a lot of experience dealing with internet trolls. One thing I've learned is that you can never really defeat them. If you argue with them, they enjoy that, they thrive on it. If you ban them, they just come back under a different name. But one thing they do fundamentally hate is having their identities exposed. Now, I wouldn't say that internet trolls are all of the same ilk as the social media extremists, but a lot of them are, especially when it comes to the volume you see out there on the internet. So I'm wondering to what extent perhaps shifting the platforms they're on towards more verified identities might serve to counter this. I think we've already seen some of that. Like originally on Facebook, you could just make an account that didn't even have to be a real person at all. It could just be like a cartoon character. And obviously, they still have a lot of problems there verifying identities, but they are trying to move in that direction. I think Google is as well. Your YouTube account is now linked to your Google account, whether you want it to be or not. So perhaps that's something we could do. I mean, I know obviously there are free speech implications with that, but anonymity is not necessarily protected. You can have free speech without having anonymous speech. It's the same reason why in real life there are social costs for everything you say. So perhaps we can impose those social costs by reducing anonymity. I don't love the idea, but it's an idea.
Any thoughts?
I'm happy to take a first whack. I feel bad that I get the first shot at each of these. So one thing we could talk more about this offline. I would probably resist the troll comparison. Trolling is its own phenomenon. Trollers talk about having split identities in the real world and online. As Seamus said, unfortunately, those who sort of work for ISIS to recruit, very much it is their identity. They really believe what they're doing. Trolling is for lulls, as trollers call it, for a certain form of laughs. This is for real violence. So I wouldn't want to push that. I think there's probably key differences between the trolling phenomenon and the terrorist recruitment phenomenon. But that doesn't undercut your point that if you're sitting in the U.S. government, would you rather there be only ways to figure out who's behind accounts? If you're in the government, probably yes, and probably not just for counterterrorism purposes, but for or even ordinary law enforcement purposes. It is, as you know, integral to the vision, I might even say the identity of some of these companies, that they offer differing degrees of anonymity or something short of anonymity. And I think that's almost a cultural gap, right, between how law enforcement agencies think about their responsibility to know what they can about individuals that come on their radar screen and the views of at least portions of those behind these technologies that are deliberately disruptive in sometimes very good ways when they're trying to enable voices to speak out as dissidents against authoritarian regimes and such. So I don't imagine the companies making a shift on that anytime soon, nor do I see feasibly legislation imposing that on companies. But what you're channeling, I think, would get a lot of sympathy from those who find it hard to see this material from within government and feel that it's hard to peek behind it when there are things of sufficient concern to get on law enforcement's radar.
Yeah, that was one of the more unique questions I've ever gotten, so congratulations on that. I wish you went to GW, not American. No, I thought it was very good. I want to think about it a little bit more. My initial reaction on one of these is, I interview a lot of American jihadis or folks that are either going to jail or getting out of jail or don't know they're going to jail, but they're going to jail. I find actually they're very kind of overt about it. They're fervent in their beliefs, and they want to talk to me about why they believe that they believe, and hopefully, convert me to that belief system too. And so, for the most part, I don't actually see much kind of anonymity, at least for that kind of subset of folks. Maybe online, but at least for the interviews, it's not like they're hiding who they are. particularly in the U.S. where you think of Samir Khan, who is very blatant about the way he did things online, knowing full well what the right and left lines were on material supports terrorism, and in fact hiring a First Amendment lawyer to advise him before he decided to join Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So I want to think about that question more, and in fact I'd like to talk a little bit more about it afterwards. I thought it was very good.
The one thing, I guess 2 points on that. One is, when in Das Treyer's remarks, he said one of the things we want to avoid is a fragmented internet, right? And I think what he meant by that is we want to avoid a system where there's exactly something like this, where there's one internet that you use with your real identity, but then that creates basically a spin-off of the dark web where all this other nefarious stuff is going on, and you can do things in a sort of more ambiguous way. And I think there's a concern that pushing for something like everything you do online has to be
Verified.
attributable to a verified identity threatens to fragment the internet in that way, which could have very real and dangerous implications for the U.S., both in terms of the development of our technology, sort of all the economic implications of having Facebook and Twitter and Microsoft all here, and also have real benefits for authoritarian regimes like Russia and China, which basically rely on trying to have something like, we know exactly who you are and know everything that you say, right? So there's a certain openness and that comes with an anonymity that I think we like about the internet. The other thing that I'd say is, it was really interesting, this is a related point, but it struck me when Google and Facebook and other companies were in town testifying about the Russia election meddling, and Facebook said, well, we kicked a lot of people off of Facebook because we found that they violated our user service agreement because they weren't who they said they were. But it wasn't because they were trying to be anonymous or they lied about their identity. It's because they said, our user service agreement says that you have to be authentic. And these were not authentic profiles because they said they were Joe Schmo and they were some Russian. And I think it's exactly the problem that Josh and Seamus have pointed out. It's like the jihadis are authentic, right? If they're anything, they're authentic, and they own that and they wear that. And so I think there might be interesting conversations that you could have, and I think Rob hinted at this as well. Maybe there are things that we can do when we talk with Silicon Valley about the way that these user service agreements are written, right? And maybe if it's not just about authenticity, maybe if we can build in some sort of language that says our platform will not be used for hate speech or radical ideology or something, then that gives you a way at this issue slightly differently. But interesting question.
The gentleman at the back, the hat.
Thank you. My name is Yaya Fanusi with the United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. I'm enjoying as you speak, and I'm saying, if the jihadists and the Islamic and all of those are listening to you, they will just be smiling. You see, in 1968, when Nixon was bombing North Hanoi, I said to people who were close to me that they would crash a plane on the White House, 1968. I have been over the years, I would tell close associates what the terrorists will do. And 4 or 5 years later on, people say, how did you know? Yeah, you described that. I said, if you think like them, you know what they'll do next. They're all entrepreneurs. I have something for the gentleman from State Department. Some young people in Sierra Leone made a request that Donald Trump should revive the USIS, United States Information Services Library, which was closed down in 1999, back because they need those information on books and economics, blah, 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 so that they could develop their skills. And they mentioned in that text, this will prevent them from becoming radicalized and become jihadists.
So do you have a question? Do you have a question?
Yes, they have not any response yet. I'll be talking to them. What I'm trying to explain to you is, what you're saying is because you're bureaucrats. You need to think as an entrepreneur because that's what these people are. Okay? They think like they're entrepreneurs, they're creative and innovative. All this messaging, as you have here in your conclusion, ideas, you have to prevent it to be resonate with the people who they are applying to. And the way you do that is by finding out what are the needs of these people who join jihadists.
All right, let's allow them to discuss. This idea that it seems to me that the gentleman is talking about thinking entrepreneurially and trying to figure out what some of these groups are necessarily looking for, which is obviously a much bigger question and topic than the focus we have on, talking about countering violent messages online. But I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Is this a good opportunity to say a few words on something I know you've worked on, which is how online interactions and real-world interactions kind of link up and contribute to radicalization? Because in some ways that goes to the question about circumstances in the physical world. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that all right?
Yeah. No one's ever called me a bureaucrat in 3 years. I haven't worn a tie since I left government. It's been freeing. No, I would say there are two issues there. I mean, the first one was in terms of learning the online environment very quickly. I mean, you do see jihadists very quickly understand the online environment. So after Junaid Hussain was killed, word went out from the ISIS hacking division that he was killed because he used SureSpot, and no one else used SureSpot the day after. And so they do learn which applications to use on that. On the question that I think Josh brought up, which is the connection between online and offline. So after a guy gets arrested for terrorism, we go through the Facebook, the Associated Press will go through the Facebook page and he'll have an ISIS flag on his profile. And everyone will say, that's online radicalization. Well, yeah, no, maybe not, right? In many ways, the online persona is a reflection of their offline life. And I think we tend to kind of ignore that aspect a little bit too much. So in the ideal world, you're using the online environment to then steer people to the offline space. So if you identify a young man or woman who's interested in ISIS, you communicate with them through a series of messages over a course of months, which a UK think tank has done this recently. And then you veer them on to an intervention system that has mental health professionals, social workers, and things like that. You marry up the two worlds. We haven't figured out that handoff particularly well in this context.
Other questions? Yeah, this lady here.
Hi, Bridget Johnson from Homeland Security Today. I want to thank you all for doing this panel, first of all. So there's been a lot of talk about ISIS online, and I know that the lectures of Alaki are a concern and have been a concern to people trying to stop terrorists online. But one thing I have noticed over the years, and especially as ISIS has kind of leveled off and Al-Qaeda continues to post content, often it's more practical, do-it-yourself, more useful to the lone jihadist than the ISIS content is. Recently I even discovered Al-Qaeda materials for free download on barnesandnoble.com. Somebody had put them up there, and they were up there for years. And they even had Al-Qaeda in the title, and nobody noticed. A lot of these things are very plainly branded as As-Sahab or Global Islamic Media Front, and they're just not really a focus. And, kind of peripherally, you also have companies like Cloudflare providing hacking protection to the Taliban website. So do you think that the focus on online terrorist content is almost too ISIS-centric?
I think the short answer, which is yes, basically. I understand why that was the emphasis, and this is in no way to detract from applauding the companies for trying to up their game with respect to ISIS in particular. But my short answer is yes. I think that some of the focus and emphasis on ISIS has made it a bit easier for Al-Qaeda, whether it's AQAP or whether it's Al-Qaeda in Syria and its perpetual set of rebrands, to maintain content more easily and have that content stay up longer and be replicated more easily. And that is a problem because, in particular, Al-Qaeda in Syria has gotten to the point where their productions are fairly sophisticated, slick in the way that this report talks about modern terrorist recruitment being. And I think it's a very good thing that we're talking about ISIS's physical and perhaps virtual sway shrinking. That's the result of a lot of hard work by folks across the government and other governments. But it does leave very much continuing concerns, in my book, especially about Al-Qaeda in Syria and the kind of safe haven it's been able to build in Idlib province, but also other affiliates of Al-Qaeda and other groups elsewhere. And I think taking what has been learned inside government, but in the private sector as well, and in my hope, very, very quickly applying that to other groups and their content, that strikes me as important. So I'm with you in beating that drum.
Yeah, I would just add, the difference between ISIS and Al-Qaeda online actually it raises a larger question for the tech companies too, which is ISIS is pretty overt in their violence, and don't get me wrong, Al-Qaeda is still a foreign terrorist organization, it's still violent. But they're a little bit more subtle about it. And so the question of mood music, right? Does the kind of the extremist content itself, is that enough for takedown, or does violence have to be attached to it? Musa Jibril from Michigan is kind of one of the main online ISIS kind of imams that everyone follows, him and Anwar al-Awlaki. His stuff is still available online because he never really goes too far over. And I think that's a larger debate. And finally, I think my colleague, and Josh's colleague, Bruce Hoffman, had a good piece this week on the Council on Foreign Relations about not taking our eye off the ball of Al-Qaeda. And in many ways, at the same time you had 159 Americans charged with ISIS-related activities, you had about 80 folks charged with non-ISIS but jihadist activities. So Al-Qaeda, AQAP, that group. And in many ways, sometimes you see Americans essentially becoming discerning terrorists. And they say, ISIS is too violent for me, but this foreign terrorist organization is right up my alley. And in many ways, Al-Qaeda has kind of positioned themselves, for lack of a better word, as a thinking man's foreign terrorist organization. So if you want to read 1,400 pages treatise on joining the caravan, your main thing is Al-Qaeda, right? If you want to read 140 characters about how great the caliphate is, you're going to ISIS. Sometimes I'm more worried about the guys who like the 1,400 page document. I enjoy interviewing them a lot more than the ISIS guys, but they still do concern me a little bit more.
We have about 5 minutes, and I just think we haven't really touched a lot on the technology aspect of it. The BPC report goes into great depths about encryption and the dangers posed by that and the challenges that policymakers and lawmakers have. And I just wanted to see if all of you could talk a little bit about how do you see the encryption challenge being addressed? Is it going to be coming through technology breakthroughs or legislative regulations, a combination of the two? And I was particularly intrigued this week that the FBI director, Christopher Wray, spoke in Boston, and he flagged this one app called Symphony. I think it's like a financial services information exchange app, and he talked about how that particular, it's an encrypted app, but it allows third-party storage of encryption duplicates. I mean, I'm trying to see if there, what you think about how this going dark problem gets resolved. Your thoughts?
Sure, I can start off. I mean, I think as we say in the paper, I don't think it's going to be resolved anytime soon. I think there is a big debate about whether there could be technological steps that might come out in the future, right? That could try to square the circle of both having strong encryption and backdoor access in some way. And hopefully there's research that is done and continues to be done into that. Some people claim that is two logically incompatible things that could never happen. I hold out hope that maybe there will be a technological solution. But in the meantime, I think there's a lot of ways that we can try to get around the problem, right? So one that I talked about earlier is sort of lawful hacking. There's others sort of along the lines of Symphony of a lot of these devices are backed up to the cloud, and either in the process of backing up to the cloud or the cloud backup itself is not as encrypted as the device itself. So in the case of San Bernardino, if it had been a different type of phone with a different type of backup system, it would have not posed the same problems in getting to that account. And there's also ways that you can try to get the phones to be unlocked. I think one of the interesting things is legal findings about the difference between unlocking via fingerprint versus unlocking by passcode. You can't be compelled to give up your passcode, but you can be compelled to put your thumb on the fingerprint scanner. Facial recognition
makes it even easier.
It could make that even easier. So I think there might not be a solution to going dark, but I think there at the very least are going to be workarounds that law enforcement agencies can try to develop going forward.
Yeah, I would just add that, the workarounds are expensive. That's the other issue, right? The FBI spent a serious amount of money to get the San Bernardino phone unlocked, much to the happiness of the private company that did it, right? And the larger question the FBI director brought up was, the shifting away from more interesting new platforms. There's also a question in terms of financial stuff. So we've had our first case of ISIS recruit in New York sending money to ISIS through Bitcoin. That has been a reoccurring theme in the white nationalist movement, largely funded, or at least largely using Bitcoin to fund some operations too. And so you got to keep your eye on the ball on these things. And so if we had the same event next year, I'm not sure Telegram is the channel we talk about. Right. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not. But I'm also not sure that the government's going to be able to chase quick enough to know what the next one is.
Along these lines, one point, I think a good recommendation from this report that I want to lift up is the idea of getting folks across the government, and I would add to that getting folks in the private sector to talk about what sometimes gets called digital dust or digital exhaust, which is content and metadata is not always a helpful distinction, but at least for lack of a better term, with the content remaining encrypted, it's the other stuff that today's apps generate in the course of communications. And there is a sense that the report points at, and that I think is at least in part right, that is currently being underutilized. And the report suggests that the government should think better about what all the different parts of it have determined is available, so that there can be kind of a systematic way to ask for that from companies. I think that has value. I also think there's something of a dance that can go on between the government not knowing exactly what these technologies generate, because the government is not the creator of them, and the companies that do comply with lawful process and hand over metadata, even if the contents are encrypted, not giving that which hasn't specifically been asked for, or perhaps that which existing law doesn't specifically authorize being asked for, depending on one's interpretation of it. And so the government doesn't know exactly sometimes what to ask for. The companies don't offer it up because it either hasn't been asked for, or perhaps in their view isn't appropriately asked for. Then the government doesn't get it, and there's room to talk there, right? There's room to say, even if it requires legislative amendment, this is something far narrower than actually dealing with encryption writ large through legislation, which may or may not ever happen, and may or may not be a good idea. And instead to get the private sector in the room with the government and saying, what does this, do these apps generate, and what would you need to feel comfortable turning it over in response to lawful process? Is that us asking? Is that us going to Congress and amending legislation so that it can be, in your view, properly asked for? That strikes me as a ripe conversation. I think the report is wise to point towards it.
Well, I think we're out of time here. We obviously have a lot of stuff here to discuss that we barely ever scratched the surface of. I mean, Seamus talked about Bitcoin. I mean, there's, the Secretary Strayer talked about artificial intelligence. So there's a lot we could get into, but unfortunately we're out of time. And I think I want to commend BPC again, because we get bombarded with dozens of different stories that have nothing to do with this topic on a daily basis, and it's an opportunity to focus on something that's way more important. And thanks very much. Thanks for participating, and thanks for the questions.